This is Omnivore presents SciDish, a podcast from the Institute of Food Technologists. In each episode, we take a deeper dive into a single topic shaping the future of food. Hosted by the editors of Food Technology, together with IFT members and subject matter experts, SciDish brings you the science, insights, and real-world perspectives that drive innovation, solve complex challenges, and connect disciplines across the global food system. Thanks for joining us. Let's get into the conversation.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT First, food improved by research, science, and technology. Join the leading food science and innovation expo, IFT First, at McCormick Place in Chicago, July 12th through 15th, for the industry's premier event connecting innovation, science, and business. Learn more at ift.org.
Hi, I'm Julie Larson-Brisher, Science and Technology Editor for Food Technology Magazine, your host for this episode of SciDish. Today's conversation is about meat, but probably not in the way you were expecting. Our SciDish guest is Bruce Friedrich, founder and president of the Good Food Institute. Bruce is the author of a brand new book called Meat: How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future, which has already been named one of Publisher Weekly's top 10 new releases in science. What makes this book so compelling is what it isn't. This is not an anti-meat manifesto. Bruce is very clear from page 1. He's not here to tell anyone what to eat. Instead, Meat asks a much more practical and urgent question. If humanity is going to keep eating more meat every year, can science help us make it far more efficiently, safely, and sustainably? Drawing on food science, biotechnology, economics, and public policy, the book argues that feeding crops to animals, an approach we've used for 12,000 years, is an outdated production system. In the book, Bruce explores how plant-based and cultivated meat could deliver the same sensory and nutritional outcomes while dramatically reducing environmental, health, and security risks. In this episode, we're talking with Bruce to dig into the science behind the claims, the real bottlenecks to scale, why major meat companies are investing in these technologies, and the policies quietly shaping what comes next. Bruce Friedrich, welcome.
Thank you so much, Julie. I am delighted and honored to be here.
Great. Well, let's dive right in then. So I read in your bio, Bruce, that you grew up in Oklahoma cattle country, and that makes me curious. Did you ever imagine that you'd end up leading a global organization focused on rethinking how meat is made?
No. And not to put too fine a point on it, as you said, growing up in Oklahoma, surrounded by cattle, I think like the vast majority of people, this is just how meat is made. It's been made this way for as long as there has been agriculture. And I think there's an assumption that it will continue to be made this way for as long as people are eating meat, which is probably going to be forever. So I definitely had no idea that I would be going into the meat-making nonprofit business.
Right. Well, let's talk about the book, Meat, which just published in February. You opened the book by saying you're not trying to change anyone's diet. Why was that such an important place to start? And how does that framing change the conversation around meat?
Well, I think people rightly don't enjoy being told what to do. And it really does devolve into something that looks sort of culture warish when you start saying that a certain method of making meat is unethical, or consuming meat is unethical, or telling people what to eat for their health sort of moves into nanny stateism. So I think it's just incredibly unhelpful to tell people what to eat. And I think it's also helpful to get that preconception out of the way immediately. Somebody sees a book titled Meat, and it's about remaking meat. They might assume that it's about encouraging people to eat less meat, but there are plenty of books about that. This is not one of them.
Well, I think there's a striking claim in meat. You write that humanity is not going to eat less meat, even with climate and health pressures. So what does the data tell us that many people, about why many people still resist accepting?
Yeah, I don't know if it's as much resist accepting the data or if it's just that biologically, physiologically, maybe there's something emotional or cultural. Food is really deeply personal. And I also think there is probably something biological, physiological for up until very, very recently, the vast majority of human beings had a daily struggle for existence. And what that meant was that foods that are particularly high in fat, particularly calorically dense, those foods were the things that allowed you to survive. And so they tasted delicious to us to incentivize our consuming them and not starving. Now we're in a world where things are radically different. And most of us, certainly in developed economies, are getting plenty of calories or maybe too many calories. But the psychology of millions of years of evolution has not changed. And so I think the vast majority of people, they just don't take ethics into account with regard to food choices. And there are just so many studies and surveys. They don't even really take health into account. It's like a distant third. There's certainly a segment of the population that is considering ethics, the vegetarians, the vegans, the meat reducers. And there's a segment of the public that's taking health significantly into account. But it really is, these are niche categories. These are niche products. Unless you can come along and say, actually, the healthy thing is the thing that you find delicious and craveable. Then you'll get people who say they're taking health into account, but really they're just eating something that they find delicious and craveable and saying they're doing it for health reasons. So I think, one of the clearest trends in social sciences is that globally, the more a country develops, the more meat that country is going to eat on a per capita basis. So since the UN Food and Agriculture Organization started measuring in 1961, every single year since then, meat and poultry consumption has hit a new global record. And all predictions are, assuming we continue to develop economically and assuming the population gets larger, the world is going to continue to eat more meat every single year, certainly past 2050. As long as we're getting wealthier, as long as there are more of us, we're going to be eating more meat. And we come up against some of the external costs of meat production, which make that problematic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And this may be a little off track, but I worked in the meat and poultry industry for a while in publications, and we actually launched a magazine in the alt meat area. It was called Alt Meat. And
I love that magazine.
Right, yeah, I know, right? Lisa Keefe says hi. But I think that what we saw, because like you're saying, we tracked it and reported on those statistics, and it was interesting because India was one of the leading countries who, because it's developing, the middle class is now becoming upper middle class. They can afford the meat, even with the sort of religious constraints, right, against eating meats in many cases. That segment of their population is growing so rapidly that they almost have already had a lot of alternative protein sources, right? That operate like meat, sort of fungi based, I guess, stuff like that. And I just find it really interesting that we're talking about a country like that where you would think that the market would be limited, but for the fact that they're developing and getting richer basically and can afford all of those things, that it's come down into the middle class, right? Come down to the lower middle class.
Yeah,
be
I mean,
able
meat
to afford
consumption in India is up 300% in the
it.
last
Yeah,
25 years.
it's amazing.
It's still relatively low by
Mhm.
comparison to countries that have like an equal average GDP, but it's up 300% in 25 years, which is pretty remarkable.
That's amazing. Well, now in the book, you also write about how more than 50 years of meat reduction advocacy hasn't changed the trajectory. Why do you think it hasn't worked, and what should we learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I posit that if you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where ethics figure in is toward the top, in particular with self-actualization. That's where people are making ethical decisions. With physiological decisions, which is the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it seems to be what Daniel Kahneman, the economist, the Nobel Prize winning economist, what he calls in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, Systems 1 thinking. And I offer some examples where I think the vast majority of people, if you said, if there were green beans and they were labeled, heart healthy, slimming, no label, and delectable, would one of those cause you to eat the green beans as opposed to one of the others? Most people are going to say, and I actually did run this experiment in college classrooms, most people are going to say, doesn't matter. It's just a question of whether I want green beans or not. But the people who think that the label might have an impact say almost 100% of them say either the slimming or the heart healthy are the labels that are going to cause them to eat more green beans. And that's because they're sitting in a classroom and they're thinking about it. So they're using systems 2 thinking. Overwhelmingly, the opposite is true. In the moment where people are not thinking about it, they're not challenged to think about it, it's just a real world situation, they go with delectable because they don't want to deny themselves in that moment. It's the same reason, even if you go to a Whole Foods, in sort of its heyday of health halo, if you look at what people are actually buying, it's a lot of high fat food. It's a lot of high sugar food. All of us had the experience of going to the restaurant and eating more than we expected, going to the grocery store and buying more than we expected. We're hungry. So when we're sitting, at home thinking, how do I want to eat? We're generally a lot more aligned to healthfulness than when we actually go to the grocery store or go to the restaurant, because our willpower gets away from us, and we go from systems 2 to systems 1. I think the massive uptick in meat consumption all over the world is sort of that micro observation at a macro level.
Oh, wow. That's a great way to put it. Well, and now you also describe conventional meat production as an inefficient technology, essentially cycling crops through animals. And so from a food science perspective, what are the biggest inefficiencies we're finally able to bypass?
Yeah, and I think, most people don't think about this. I certainly didn't growing up in Oklahoma, spending a lot of time in Minnesota, going to college in Iowa. But it is just the case that the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat is the chicken. It takes 9 calories fed to a chicken in the form of animal feed to get 1 calorie back out. Probably most people listening are concerned about food waste. Something like 25 to 30% of calories produced globally are lost to food loss and waste, is the sort of term of art for that. And I think most of us see that as something that is like problematic beyond the loss of profits. Like it feels wasteful. 100, you want to make 100 calories of food, you're going to lose, you're going to not eat. 25 to 30 of them are going to be lost. But for 100 calories of chicken, you need to produce 900 calories of feed. 800 of those calories go into raising the animal, keeping them warm, walking around, whatever, or go into bones and blood and feathers if it's a chicken. And that's the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat. And then you add to that, you're growing all of those crops, all of the extra water and fertilizer and everything else, you're shipping it to a feed mill and operating a feed mill and shipping the feed to the farm and operating the farm and shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse and operating the slaughterhouse. It's a lot of inefficiency once you add all of that up. What that means is significant problems for the environment, for food prices, what it also means is a massive economic opportunity for figuring out how we innovate that and get to a place where we can make something that is identical from the vantage of the consumer. And because it's so much more efficient, you can do it at a lower cost. And that's really food science from the beginning to the end. You've got millions of years of evolution that get you to a place where animal fats and animal proteins behave differently from plant fats and plant proteins. Millions of years of evolution that get you to a place where meat has that umami flavor. For cultivated meat, you're growing the exact same thing, so that's not the same challenge. For plant-based meat, you've got all that. And then you've also got off flavors in things like soy or pea or chickpeas or whatever it is that you want to, whatever protein you're going to use as the substitute for animal protein. Animal fats and animal proteins behave differently from plant fats and plant proteins. And then the flavoring is also a significant challenge. So there's really a lot for food science to dive into and try to fix. And if you define food science sort of even more broadly, which I think we should, if you're going to create animal proteins, animal fats, basically in cultivators instead of in live animals, but they're still animal fats and animal proteins, that is also going to move into biomaterials sciences and tissue engineering and chemical engineering. It's a really big scientific challenge.
We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment. But first, this word from our sponsor.
IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists, invites you to join your colleagues across the Food Science Network at IFT First this July 12th to 15th at Chicago's McCormick Place. For the first time, all scientific programming will happen directly in the expo hall, creating seamless connections between research and real-world applications. You'll have the opportunity to learn about cutting-edge science, then immediately explore available solutions with exhibitors in one dynamic environment. Get connected with cutting-edge tech, global leaders, and the innovations shaping our food future. Registration is open. Secure your spot today at IFT.org. That's IFT.org.
All right, well, that triggers a couple of things. So let's dig a little deeper into, now that we're talking about plant-based and cultivated meats. They're often discussed together, but the technical challenges are really different for each. So where do you see the hardest, I would say, scientific bottlenecks right now? Is it texture? Is it cost of the growth media? Is it scalability or nutrition? Or something else? Where are the bottlenecks for each of those?
Yeah, and just to make sure we quickly define terms.
Yeah.
So plant-based meat is what it sounds like, but I do think a lot of people think when we say plant-based meat that we mean veggie burgers as they have existed for the last 60 or more years. The brainstorm of plant-based meat is that animal meat is made up of fats, proteins, minerals, and water. Plants also have fats, proteins, minerals, and water. What does it look like to basically coax plant materials to behave exactly the same way as animal materials when you're putting meat together? And really, the first two products to try to do this, I think in the history of the world, really, were the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, which launched a little less than 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, right now, as we're talking, there was no Beyond Burger. There was no Impossible Burger. And up until that point, the idea was, as long as it kind of looks the same, as long as you can put it on a grill if you're going out to grill, that's fine. This was not for everybody. It was for vegetarians, meat reducers. It was a niche product. And that's fine. You can have a $600, $700 million a year industry in the United States with niche products for vegetarians, flexitarians, meat reducers. But the real brainstorm of plant-based meat is we should be able to make something that is indistinguishable. And because it's more efficient, we should be able to make it cheaper. That already wins on nutrition with a macronutrient analysis, certainly in developed economies, a little different if you're talking about developing economies. And then cultivated meat is just the same thing. So it wins on nutrition over industrial meat, maybe not wins on nutrition over agroecologically or regeneratively raised animal products, but it wins over industrial meat just because it doesn't have the same tendency to have drug residues. It doesn't have the same bacterial contamination. But in both cases, there are huge scientific bottlenecks. On the plant-based meat side, the best oil for replicating saturated fat is coconut oil. It's not perfect. It's just the best we've got. So there's a lot of opportunity to innovate in oils, a lot of opportunity to innovate in umami flavors, a lot of opportunity to innovate in masking agents, because peas and soy and chickpeas, they all have sort of off flavors that are designed to try to protect them from being eaten, basically. And so we need food science to come in and figure out how to mask those flavors. And one of the things that we find is that a lot of plant-based meat companies, the ones that have the products that meat eaters like the most, they're spending as much for the flavors and the masking agents as they are spending for the protein. So it ends up being not that much as a percentage of ingredients, but critical and really, really expensive because they're not buying enough of it to get the price down. So those are some of the areas on the plant-based side. On the cultivated meat side, I mean, the first thing to say is costs are down by a factor of 100,000 in about 12 years. They're down 99.999% for one of the companies, the first company to start working in this area, Mosa Meat. And I think they're down something like that for upside as well, and probably for the industry as a whole. That's pretty remarkable. It's still twice as expensive as beef, so 6 times as expensive as chicken maybe to produce, but in 12 years, that's pretty remarkable. The thing that doesn't acknowledge, though, is that that's at a pretty small scale. If we are going to be producing at a large scale, we're going to have to figure out how to get animal fats and proteins to grow in cultivators. Right now, they're growing at 20,000 liters, which we didn't know until Vow started doing it. We didn't know if that was absolutely possible. To really hit commercial scale, they're going to have to grow at least 50,000, and better yet, if they're growing at 200,000 liters or even 1 million liters, and that's going to be a significant challenge. There are also challenges around the media that feed the animal fat and animal muscle, but the early expectation that was going to be really challenging has turned out so far to apparently not be true. There are like 150 companies, or there have been something like 150 companies. I'm not sure how many of them still exist, but media costs are way lower than even the most optimistic early projections. And some of the early projections that said cultivated meat isn't going to work assumed that we wouldn't be able to get media costs below like $6.50 a liter. There are people doing it for 25 cents a liter now without having had to put that much effort and resources into figuring that out.
Yeah, it really is amazing in such a short period of time from when it was the $12,000 burger or whatever it was. Well, it was some amazing amount of money, and I can't believe it. I mean, think of the leaps that could be made in the next 10 years. There's some momentum, I think. And you were just talking about taste and price parity, which are recurring themes in the book. From your vantage point, Bruce, like which scientific advances are doing the most to close those gaps?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental observation / thesis of the book is that plant-based meat and cultivated meat will stay niche until they reach price and taste parity. And they really do need to reach both. So the fact that there are now half a dozen really good products doesn't mean that those products are going to sell well, because the value proposition for the consumer, or at least for the average consumer, is not sufficiently there to move those products beyond niche. So they really do have to get to taste and price parity. Cultivated meat has already passed taste parity. Like people who try cultivated meat say this is basically like heritage chicken. So it's better than most chicken people are eating from a taste vantage, because it's like, your perfect chicken, and they can replicate that over and over and over. Plant-based meat, no product is quite there, but there are half a dozen products, according to Nectar, which is NECTAR. It's a project of food system innovations that looks at precisely that. How delicious are the plant-based alternatives to animal meat, dairy, and eggs? And they found half a dozen of them that satisfy most meat eaters. I think it's like 4 Impossible products, plus the Beyond Burger, 1 Gardein product, 1 Morningstar product. So I guess that would be 7. Maybe it was just 3 Impossible products are there on taste. But what that means is that like 115 are not there on taste. We've got 6 out of 120, I think. So we do have room to go. And I think the main thing on taste is really, if what you were doing is just squishing some ingredients together, you are unlikely to get to taste parity. So in the early days when Impossible and Beyond launched about 10 years ago, there were a whole bunch of sort of copycat companies or ostensible copycat companies. And they said, we are the next Impossible, we are the next Beyond. And then you look at their deck and they wouldn't have a chief science officer. They wouldn't have anybody doing food sciences. They wouldn't have any R&D budget. And it's like, no, you're the next Garden Burger. It took millions of dollars to put together the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, and like significant science teams. If you don't have that, you're not going to get to taste parity. And that really gets to, what do we need? We need a lot more B2B, and we need a lot more R&D focused companies, ideally R&D focused companies that are focused on B2B. One of the really great things that we've seen with cultivated meat over the last maybe 6 years or so is companies coming along and solving specific challenges and then marketing their innovations to the broader ecosystem. So we are going to design cells, or we are going to design bioreactors, or we are going to design cell culture media, and we're going to market that to the rest of the industry. We haven't seen very much of that on the plant-based side, which is unfortunate, because imagine if Impossible, instead of keeping their heme to themselves, were marketing that B2B to the entire industry. Or if somebody comes along with a really great alternative to extrusion that isn't so energy intensive, isn't so wasteful in terms of batches that have to be condemned, et cetera, comes along and solves that problem, or solves coconut oil. You can solve that for one company that's a consumer-facing brand, or you can solve that for the entire industry. And so far, everybody is doing all of the research as well as marketing their products. And all of that is hard. It's hard to operate an R&D company. It's hard to operate a consumer brand. Put those things both together, and it becomes particularly hard, which is one of the things that I talk about in the book.
How the major meat and ingredient companies like Tyson, JBS, Cargill, they're investing heavily in this space, and from a technical standpoint, what capabilities do you think these sort of incumbent, meat companies bring that like startups often lack? And where do startups have the edge?
Yeah, I mean, it's a small part of the incumbent's business, and they're also doing a lot of different things. One of the massive advantages of being Cargill or ADM or JBS or Tyson is that you have the capital that you need to put money into R&D. You also have the capital that you need to get a standard bank loan to set up a manufacturing company. One of the things that has really made it difficult for the startups, so Stephen Finn from Citi Capital at the Tufts conference last year was talking about the company Meaty and the company Sci-Fi Foods. And he was saying that what happened with both of those companies, their science was really strong in both cases. And what happened with both of them was they had a lead investor that ended up deciding to go in a different direction. and they didn't have a sufficiently robust and varied cap table such that they were able to find somebody else to take on the role of lead investor. And they also, because they're small and not, they don't have significant revenues yet, they weren't able to get bank loans to get them to the other side. No matter how good your tech is, if you don't have the money to put up a production plant and you can't get the loan to do that, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So that's one of the areas where having a multi-billion-dollar company is going to really stand you in a much better place. One of the areas where, I think the meat industry is a bit notorious for being less innovative and forward-thinking than it might be. We have been incredibly delighted, gratified, pleased by how much the meat industry is embracing alternative meats, how enthusiastic they are about its prospects, but actually getting into a lab and doing the R&D, the incentives just don't line up that well if 99% or 99.5% of your business is one thing. You don't have the same incentive to go out and innovate, even if you have sort of the will to go out and innovate. So one of the things I'm really excited about is blends. What does it look? And in fact, this is one of the ways I think we get us to the other side of scale. So scale is really, really the kicker. Scale is really the thing that's hard. You need to bring down your prices to sell a lot of your product, but it's hard to bring down your prices until you sell a lot of your product. So it's the quintessential catch-22. And the two ways you get to the other side of that, I think, and there are actually at least three ways you get to the other side of that. One is you sell other products that allow you to scale up. So it's been really nice to see some of the companies, you're seeing Impossible is moving into, I think, pastas and breads, and Beyond is moving into drinks, and some of the cultivated meat companies are selling pharmaceuticals and that sort of thing. That allows them to get to profitability and scale up what it is that they're doing. Another really exciting thing, I think, is blends. If you have 50% soy protein or mycoprotein and 50% just standard chicken meat or pork or beef, that gets you past the flavoring problems that I just mentioned, as well as the off flavors problems that I just mentioned. Your animal meat does those things for you. And pretty quickly, you should be able to get to price and taste parity. That's one where I think startups are going to have the clear advantage. Maybe the Tyson Raised and Rooted, I think, is an example of that. I don't know for sure. I wasn't, in the Tyson boardroom when they were discussing Raised and Rooted, but it does feel to me like the concept was extraordinarily strong, but the products were priced at a premium, and I'm not sure they did the requisite R&D back in the meat lab to make sure that the products were really excellent. Possibly I'm wrong on both of those, but that's my impression. I know for sure that they didn't have the same incentive to launch a new product that a startup would have. So I'm incredibly bullish about the idea of startups doing blends, especially blends with soy protein and mycoprotein. And I imagine a Cargill or an ADM or a Tyson could do that even more successfully. But the incentives are not as aligned. They don't have to be successful. They don't have to make it work in the way that a startup does.
Let's wrap up with the big crystal ball question, right? So looking ahead, what do you think success looks like for food scientists in this field? Like in 20 years, 10, maybe even 10 years, how should we expect alternative proteins to integrate into, not replace, the global meat system?
It'll be interesting to see, right? One of the things I have been really, really, one of the early things that I found very surprising, I started working on GFI roughly 10 years ago now, a little bit more than 10 years ago now. We launched into the world on February 1st of 2016, but at that point, there were just two of us. And I think by June, I was on a panel alongside the person who had been hired to run Tyson's venture capital fund. And it was interesting. We were both absolutely agreeing that consumers are going to dictate what happens. Nobody is interested in, and even if we were interested in, there is no possibility that anything having to do with food is going to be dictated to anybody. So the things that matter in food, most important being taste and price, followed somewhat distantly by nutrition, healthfulness, that's going to dictate what happens. My prediction is that we are going to see growing support from governments all over the world for plant-based and cultivated meat. It's a much more efficient way of producing meat. And what that means is that for governments that care about food self-sufficiency, food security, the fragility and vulnerability of the current meat production method, like that's a big incentive for companies. It's also a big incentive for governments. So I think we're going to see governments funding more and more food science. 7 years ago, the only governments funding in this space were Israel and Singapore because they're tiny countries that are tech forward and import the vast majority of their food. But now every government that funds significant agriculture, so India, Brazil, the US, China, the EU, every government that funds significant technology, biotechnology, so add Japan, Korea, a bunch of European countries independently, are funding in this space. And they're doing that for economic competitiveness reasons. They're doing that for food security reasons. So we've gone from zero to quite a lot in 6 or 7 years. I think as we see that continue, we're going to see new opportunities open up. I think on the plant-based and cultivated meat side, we can get to parity and then we can keep going. I mentioned that cultivated chicken. People already say it's like the best chicken I ever had. I think we can do that with beef. We can do that with pork. You look at what the Australian company Vow Foods is doing. They've got something that's sort of a cross between duck and foie gras, but it's not even duck. It's like clearly poultry, but it's not from a species that's ever existed. But it satisfies what people like about duck and foie gras and meat. I think we'll see a lot more of that sort of thing, so a lot more variety. I think we'll also see, the people like Joe Rogan and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who really want sort of circle of life, and then the people like Michael Pollan and Alice Waters, who really want regenerative, agroecological meat, people who are interested in heritage breed meat. I think we'll see a lot more of that as the industrial animal meat is more and more shifting in the direction of plant-based meat and cultivated meat, which is safer and healthier, and the production systems are just far tighter and consequently less fragile.
I love an episode that ends on such a positive, forward-thinking note. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today, Bruce, and congratulations on the accolades the book has received, especially the nod right out of the gate by Publishers Weekly, which selected meat as one of the 10 best new releases in science for spring 2026. And listeners, you can find Bruce's book, Meat: How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future, available for purchase at meatbook.org, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other major retailers. Thanks again, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Julie. It was fun.
Our thanks to IFT First, food improved by research, science, and technology, for supporting this episode. Don't miss the leading food science and innovation expo coming to Chicago this July. Explore the future of food innovation and register today at ift.org.
And that concludes this episode of Omnivore Presents SciDish. Thanks again to our guests for another amazing discussion. SciDish is produced by the Institute of Food Technologists and the editors of Food Technology magazine. To learn more about IFT and how we convene global food system professionals to advance the science of food, visit ift.org. If you're not already a member, head to ift.org/membership to find your place in the IFT community. For more insights, ideas, and innovation, check out our sister podcast, Omnivore, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. Join us again next month for another timely discussion. This is Omnivore Presents SciDish.